At 67 years old, having survived the volatile reigns of 4 Tudor monarchs, Dr. John Story lay fully conscious on an execution block, screaming as a blade sliced his stomach open. The blood-soaked executioner simply slapped the old man across the face to silence him. This gruesome death was the climax of an international kidnapping orchestrated by Queen Elizabeth I. She secretly funded a covert operation to drag her sworn enemy back to English soil for the ultimate punishment. This brutal sentence stemmed from a deadly threat that triggered Elizabeth's deepest past trauma. Years earlier, Story publicly boasted in Parliament that he regretted not killing Elizabeth when she was young. Fleeing to Spanish territory, he actively betrayed England by sabotaging its merchant ships. Lured into a decoy vessel, Story finally learned that no one could threaten the Queen and escape her absolute power. The 16th century Tudor era in England was a period of extreme religious instability. King Henry VIII first separated England from the Catholic Church to establish his own religious authority. Following his death, his son Edward VI pushed the nation further into strict Protestantism. The situation reversed again when Mary I took the throne and aggressively restored Catholicism, executing those who resisted. Finally, Elizabeth I took power and shifted the country back to Protestantism. Surviving this era required compromise. Dr. John Story, however, refused to adapt. His strict religious beliefs made him a target. Born in the shadow of the great cathedral in Salisbury in 1504, John Story was the product of a comfortable middle-class upbringing. His parents, Nicholas and Joan, recognized early on that their son possessed a uniquely sharp analytical intellect. Seeking to cultivate this gift, they sent him to Oxford University. He was enrolled at Hinckley Hall, where the rigorous, cloistered environment perfectly suited his obsessive dedication to study. He quickly proved himself to be a brilliant, albeit rigid, legal mind. By 1535, his academic prowess was undeniable, and he was appointed as a lecturer in civil law. His reputation continued to soar, and just 2 years later he was elevated to the prestigious position of principal at Broadgates Hall, an institution that would later evolve into Pembroke College. By 1538, Story had reached the pinnacle of academic achievement, earning his highly coveted doctorate in civil law. With this supreme credential in hand, he transitioned from the quiet halls of academia to the bustling, cutthroat legal world of London. He married a woman named Joan Watts, began building a family, and established a highly lucrative and deeply respected legal practice at Doctors' Commons, a society of lawyers practicing civil law in London. His wealth grew in tandem with his social standing. His ambitions eventually led him into the political arena, where he secured a seat in Parliament, representing various constituencies over the years, including Salisbury, Hindon, and East Grinstead. By all outward appearances, Dr. John Story had achieved the ultimate Tudor dream: wealth, respect, intellectual authority, and political power. However, the foundation of his comfortable life began to violently fracture under the reign of the boy king, Edward VI. As the Protestant government began systematically and ruthlessly dismantling the ancient Catholic faith, outlawing the traditions that Story held as immutable divine truths, the scholar found himself unable to maintain the quiet compliance adopted by so many of his peers. The breaking point arrived in 1548 when Parliament introduced the sweeping Act of Uniformity. This legislation was designed to legally force Protestant worship and the newly authored Book of Common Prayer upon every parish in the entire nation, effectively criminalizing the Catholic Mass. For Story, this was not merely bad policy, it was an affront to God. Rising from his seat in the House of Commons, Story stood up and fiercely, publicly objected. He did not couch his dissent in the polite, deferential rhetoric expected of a parliamentarian. He actively insulted the crown. With the entire chamber watching in stunned silence, the furious scholar thundered a direct quotation from the Bible, specifically Ecclesiastes, shouting, "Woe unto thee, O land, when thy king is a child." In the paranoid, tightly controlled environment of Tudor England, speaking such treasonous words was a virtual death sentence, especially when delivered on the floor of the House of Commons. The government's retaliation was swift and absolute. Story was immediately stripped of his dignity and thrown into the grim confines of prison. The cold reality of his cell quickly illuminated the immense mortal danger he had courted. Utilizing his vast legal connections and perhaps feigning a degree of submission, Story miraculously managed to secure his release. Knowing that his life hung by a thread, he rapidly gathered his family, abandoned his lucrative career, his estates, and his hard-won social status, and fled across the English Channel into exile in Louvain, Belgium. He had chosen the bitter life of a religious refugee over the abandonment of his soul. He vowed he would not return to English shores until the religious winds shifted back toward Rome. Story's bitter exile in Louvain was a period of dark, simmering resentment, but the volatile nature of Tudor politics guaranteed that no exile was ever permanent. The religious identity of the entire nation hung precariously on the frail health of a single teenage boy. As King Edward VI's lungs failed him in the summer of 1553, the Protestant establishment panicked, but across the Channel, the exiled Catholic community recognized that their moment of divine vindication was finally at hand. The wheel of fortune was about to spin violently backward, and Dr. John Story was perfectly positioned to ride it back to the absolute pinnacle of English power. It is a terrifying duality that defines the zenith of Dr. John Story's influence. On one hand, he functioned as a bureaucratic butcher whose very signature condemned hundreds of men and women to scream in the flames of Smithfield. To a terrified and traumatized nation, he was eternally despised. On the other hand, he was a righteous crusader bathed in the absolute favor of the crown. Bishops heralded him as the holy restorer of a broken kingdom and the favored son of the true church. It forces us to ask, how does a man reconcile the methodical administration of human agony with the unshakable certainty of divine mandate? The religious wind that John Story had been waiting for finally changed direction in the summer of 1553. The frail King Edward VI succumbed to illness, and after a brief failed attempt to place Lady Jane Grey on the throne, the fiercely Catholic Queen Mary I, remembered by history as Bloody Mary, seized her rightful crown. The news of Mary's ascension reached the exiled Catholic communities in Europe like a trumpet blast of divine deliverance. John Story immediately packed his belongings in Louvain and rushed back across the English Channel, stepping onto English soil not as a disgraced fugitive, but as a vindicated hero. Queen Mary, recognizing his previous loyalty, his immense legal intellect, and his willingness to sacrifice his wealth for the old faith, richly rewarded him. He was swiftly appointed Chancellor to Bishop Edmund Bonner of London, effectively taking charge of the dioceses of London and Oxford. This appointment marked the exact horrifying moment the persecuted scholar transformed into the apex predator. Queen Mary was utterly determined to surgically excise the Protestant heresy from her realm, believing that the souls of her subjects depended upon the absolute eradication of the Reformed faith. To execute this monumental and gruesome task, she required men of unbending will and flawless legal precision. Dr. John Story became one of the most powerful, feared, and devastatingly effective officials in enforcing the Marian laws against heresy. He was relentless. Where others might have felt a flicker of human empathy for the condemned, Story saw only a bureaucratic checklist of souls that needed to be purged for the greater glory of God. He was not merely a background administrator pushing papers in a dimly lit office. He was the terrifyingly public face of the Marian persecutions. He personally interrogated suspected Protestants, utilizing his vast knowledge of civil and canon law to corner them into fatal theological traps. He condemned them with cold, calculated efficiency and frequently supervised their executions to ensure the sentences were carried out to the letter of the law. Historical estimates suggest he was directly involved in examining around 200 separate cases. Because of his unyielding legal rulings and his terrifying partnership with Bishop Bonner, nearly 300 men and women, from lowly artisans to high-ranking clerics, were dragged to the stake and burned alive. His most high-profile involvement came during the trial of Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, the primary architect of the English Reformation, and the author of the very Book of Common Prayer that Story had so vehemently opposed years earlier. Story served as the Queen's legal representative at Cranmer's trial, meticulously dismantling the former archbishop's defenses. When Cranmer was famously burned at the stake in Oxford in 1556, thrusting his own right hand into the fire first, John Story's legal machinations were the wood that built the pyre. During this prolonged, terrifying period of state-sponsored violence, Queen Mary's younger half-sister, Princess Elizabeth, was living a daily nightmare. As the daughter of Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth was naturally suspected of harboring deep Protestant sympathies. She was a constant threat to Mary's Catholic vision, and she lived in paralyzing, suffocating fear that any misstep, any whispered rumor, would result in her being sent to the executioner's block at the Tower of London. John Story was a vital, highly visible cog in the machinery of terror that kept the young princess in a state of perpetual dread. Elizabeth, possessing a sharp mind and a long memory, would never forget the suffocating fear he helped instill in her. In November 1558, the Tudor pendulum swung violently once more. Queen Mary died, leaving the nation exhausted and traumatized. Elizabeth I ascended the throne, and the country flipped back to Protestantism practically overnight. The survival instinct of the Tudor court immediately kicked in. Most Catholic officials, recognizing the immense lethal danger of their new reality, quietly kept their heads down. They paid their fines for missing Protestant church services, retreated to their country estates, and desperately tried to fade into the background. Dr. John Story, however, was fundamentally incapable of such pragmatism. During Queen Elizabeth's very first Parliament in 1559, the new administration introduced sweeping legislation designed to cement the young queen as the supreme governor of the Church of England, officially undoing all of Mary's Catholic restorations. As the bill was debated, Dr. John Story stood up and delivered a speech that shocked the crowded parliamentary chamber into a state of absolute, breathless silence. Speaking openly, proudly, and without a single ounce of remorse about his time sending Protestants to the flames, he stated that his only regret in life was that he had wasted his time on the commoners. He told the stunned chamber that he deeply regretted chopping at small twigs and branches, and had foolishly forgotten to dig up the root. It was a staggering, almost suicidal display of arrogance. He was openly telling the newly crowned Queen of England to her face, in front of her entire government, that he should have had her executed when he held the power to do so. It was a direct, unapologetic attack on the legitimacy of the throne and a thinly veiled threat against the very life of the monarch. Elizabeth, showing the decisive ruthlessness that would define her reign, promptly had him arrested. Story was stripped of his parliamentary immunity and thrown into the notorious Fleet prison. He was locked up for refusing to take the oath of supremacy, for refusing to attend public worship, and for his wildly aggressive opposition to the new religious order. Yet stone walls and iron bars could not hold a man of his resourcefulness indefinitely. In 1563, utilizing his remaining connections and a brilliant intellect honed by years of legal maneuvering, Story managed a daring, breathless escape from the Fleet. Slipping through the shadows of London, he secured passage on a ship and fled across the sea to Flanders, a prosperous territory currently controlled by the immense, terrifying power of the Spanish Empire. He had escaped the Queen's immediate grasp, but in doing so, he was about to cross a line from which there could be no return. Fleeing the terrifying reach of Queen Elizabeth's newly established Protestant regime was merely the first step in Story's ultimate unraveling. By slipping away to the continent, he had successfully preserved his life and his freedom, but he had also fundamentally severed the final threads of his loyalty to the English crown. Stripped of his wealth and his homeland, his unyielding religious fanaticism rapidly metastasized into absolute, venomous treason. He was no longer content to merely survive in the shadows. He was determined to actively destroy the heretical government that had dared to outlaw his faith. This set the stage for an unprecedented collision with the world's most sophisticated intelligence network. Once in Flanders, Dr. John Story crossed a massive, irreversible legal and moral Rubicon. He fully transitioned from being a persecuted religious dissident to an active working traitor operating against the very survival of his homeland. Utilizing his legal acumen, he officially renounced his English citizenship, effectively attempting to sever the lifelong bond between subject and sovereign. In its place, he swore absolute, unwavering allegiance to King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful and militarily aggressive Catholic monarch in the world. He eagerly accepted a state pension from the Spanish court and went to work for the Duke of Alva, a fearsome military commander who was notorious across Europe for his brutal, blood-soaked suppression of Protestants in the Spanish Netherlands. Story was no longer just a bitter exile writing pamphlets. He was a newly forged weapon of the Spanish state. He was given a specific and highly damaging operational role, stationed at the bustling, economically vital port of Antwerp. His duty was to ruthlessly search incoming English merchant ships. Wielding his new Spanish authority, he confiscated valuable trade goods, arbitrarily arrested English sailors, and gleefully threw smuggled English Protestant Bibles into the flames. This was not merely religious harassment, it was a targeted, direct attack on English national security. The fragile English economy relied heavily on exporting wool and cloth through the vital arteries of Antwerp. By harassing these merchant ships, Story was single-handedly strangling his former homeland's trade revenues. Furthermore, he was leveraging his powerful position and deep Spanish resources to secretly fund and indirectly support armed Catholic rebellions back on English soil, most notably the devastating Northern Rebellion of 1569 that sought to depose Queen Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth's fledgling but highly sophisticated intelligence network had seen enough. The network was masterminded by the brilliant calculating Lord Burghley, William Cecil, and his ruthless, highly efficient spy master, Francis Walsingham. They recognized the geopolitical reality. They could not simply ask the Spanish Empire to hand over a sworn Spanish official, nor could they risk sparking an all-out catastrophic war just to catch one rogue traitor. Instead, they decided to launch an audaciously complex cross-border kidnapping right under the watchful eyes of the Spanish military. They constructed an elaborate, highly classified sting operation known today in intelligence circles as the Mouse Trap. English spies, specifically highly trained operatives named William Parker and John Lee, were dispatched deep into Flanders. They adopted the flawless cover of disgruntled English merchants who violently hated the Protestant government and wanted to secretly aid the Catholic cause. They carefully approached Story in the sweltering summer of 1570, offering him a highly confidential, irresistible tip. They whispered to the aging inquisitor that an English ship had just dropped to anchor nearby at the port of Bergen op Zoom. They assured him the vessel was secretly loaded to the brim with heretical literature destined for the flames, alongside highly valuable smuggled contraband ripe for seizure. The spies knew exactly how to play the psychology of their target. The bait was perfectly, flawlessly designed. It deeply appealed to his unyielding religious fanaticism, offering him the intoxicating chance to burn more Protestant heresy. Yet it simultaneously appealed to his earthly greed, as corrupt port officials of the era regularly pocketed the lucrative smuggled goods they confiscated. Story swallowed the bait completely. In August of 1570, he confidently boarded the docked English ship, accompanied by only a handful of light guards. He felt completely, arrogantly untouchable. He was a high-ranking Spanish official operating legally on sovereign Spanish territory. He had absolutely no reason to fear a few lowly, subservient English merchants. He strode purposefully across the deck and climbed down the narrow wooden ladder into the ship's dark, claustrophobic cargo hold to personally inspect the supposed contraband. The exact moment his boots hit the floorboards, the trap snapped violently shut. English agents hidden on the deck instantly slammed the heavy wooden hatch down, throwing the iron bolts and locking the elderly scholar inside the pitch-black hold. Simultaneously, a strike team of agents swiftly and quietly overpowered his few Spanish guards. Men armed with axes chopped through the heavy mooring ropes in a matter of seconds. They unfurled the sails, caught the prevailing wind, and sped out into the open, unforgiving sea. Before the local Spanish port authorities even realized a crime had occurred, the ship was cutting through the waves, heading straight for the safety of the English port of Yarmouth. Dr. John Story, the great and terrifying inquisitor, had been successfully abducted. He was dragged back to London in heavy iron chains and thrown into the grim, damp confines of the Tower of London. When his treason trial convened at Westminster in 1571, the highly publicized proceedings brought up a fascinating, unprecedented legal and historical controversy. Story, ever the brilliant and combative lawyer, flatly refused to enter a plea. Standing before the panel of English judges, he eloquently and forcefully argued that they had absolutely no legal jurisdiction to try him. He stated that he was, by legal definition, no longer an English citizen, but a legally sworn subject of the King of Spain. Furthermore, he argued that he was working in his official capacity as a Spanish magistrate on sovereign Spanish soil when he was illegally and aggressively abducted by foreign terrorists. In his precise legal mind, the English court had no right to judge a foreign national. The English judges coldly dismissed his intricate argument by invoking a rigid ancient legal doctrine, nemo potest exuere patriam. Translated, the bedrock principle means no man can renounce his country. The court formally ruled that loyalty to the English crown was an inescapable condition of birth. It was a permanent, lifelong bond woven into his very blood. A subject could not simply decide to stop being English. Therefore, by attempting to change his nationality to a hostile enemy state and actively working to destroy English interests, he was providing the ultimate, undeniable, and self-confessed proof of high treason against his sovereign queen. The highly theatrical trial was a foregone conclusion. His meticulous defense was entirely thrown out. He was quickly found guilty and sentenced to die the most horrific, agonizing death the Tudor state could legally provide. The execution of Dr. John Story took place on June 1st, 1571. It remains one of the most grim, deeply disturbing events of the era, forcing modern eyes to gaze upon the brutal reality of human suffering that fundamentally underpinned the politics of the Tudor age. At 67 years old, Story was violently strapped to a flat wooden hurdle. He was dragged for miles through the jagged stones, dirt, and raw manure of London streets, traveling from the Tower all the way to the notorious execution grounds at Tyburn. When he finally arrived, battered and bleeding, he was granted the customary chance to speak to the massive, jeering crowd that had gathered for the spectacle. He delivered a long, wildly defiant speech. He absolutely refused to ask for Queen Elizabeth's forgiveness for his actions. He held fast and true to his Orthodox Catholic faith, loudly declaring that he died a proud martyr for the only true church. His only fleeting moment of human vulnerability came when he broke his stoic facade to beg the Queen to show financial mercy to his devoted wife, Joan, and his 4 small children, who were now left entirely destitute and permanently stained by his treason. He was roughly placed in the wooden cart. The heavy hemp noose was secured tightly around his neck, and the cart was violently pulled away. He dropped, the rope tightened, and he began to strangle. But the executioner had received highly specific malicious orders from the state. He did not let the old man hang until his neck broke or he suffocated to death. He swiftly cut the rope while Story was still completely alive, fully conscious, and desperately gasping for air. Story hit the hard ground with a sickening thud. He was immediately grabbed by the executioner's burly assistants, stripped entirely naked in front of the roaring crowd, and tied down securely to a blood-stained wooden block. The executioner took a sharp, specialized blade and sliced his abdomen wide open to begin the agonizing process of evisceration. As the executioner reached his hands deep inside the open wound to violently pull out his bowels, the elderly scholar fought back with everything he had left. In a sudden explosive surge of desperate, unimaginable agony, Story violently thrashed against his bonds, screamed in absolute terror, and tried to physically push the executioner away from his mangled body. The executioner, his hands slick and heavy with the condemned man's hot blood, grew deeply frustrated by the chaotic struggle. He paused his grisly, methodical work, raised his bloodied hand, and delivered a massive, heavy slap directly across Dr. John Story's face to force him into silence. It is a singular, horrific detail that sticks vividly in the mind, echoing disturbingly through the centuries. That slap was not part of the official legal sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering. It was a raw, deeply human moment of utter indignity. In his final fleeting seconds of absolute torment, the proud Oxford scholar, the terrifying, untouchable judge who had coldly sent hundreds to the roaring fires, was treated with the casual, dismissing disrespect of a drunken tavern brawl. He was violently stripped of all his intellectual dignity mere moments before he was stripped of his life. His vital organs were ripped out and thrown into a smoking brazier of fire right before his fading, agonizing eyes, and his long life finally ended. His mutilated corpse was then brutally butchered and cut into 4 quarters. The severed pieces were boiled in a massive cauldron of tar to preserve the rotting flesh against the weather, and his head was spiked on London Bridge as a highly visible, gruesome warning to anyone who thought they could defy the Queen's authority. The political implications of John Story's kidnapping and horrific execution were massive and immediate. For Queen Elizabeth, it was a breathtaking display of absolute, terrifying geopolitical power. It sent a crystal-clear, chilling message to rebel Catholics conspiring across Europe. The English intelligence network had an incredibly long reach. They could reach out into the dark and grab you, drag you home, and butcher you, no matter what foreign flag you attempted to hide behind. The shocking event also prompted the frightened English Parliament to take immediate draconian legislative action. They swiftly drafted and passed the Treason Act of 1571. This harsh, sweeping new law made it a capital offense to call the Queen a heretic, to publish that she was not the rightful, lawful monarch, or to bring any written bulls or influence from the Pope into the country. Story's arrogant defiance had essentially, tragically, tightened the noose around the neck of every single Catholic left hiding in England. Diplomatically, the entire affair was an unmitigated disaster. The blatant armed kidnapping of a sworn Spanish official directly from sovereign Spanish territory deeply and personally insulted King Philip II. It violently severed the already fragile, fracturing diplomatic ties between England and Spain. The execution of John Story acted as a major, undeniable catalyst in accelerating the bitter geopolitical tensions that would eventually lead an enraged Philip to launch the mighty Spanish Armada against the shores of England in 1588. Far from the roaring, bloodthirsty crowd at Tyburn, the news of Story's horrific death rippled across the sea. It eventually reached a young, brilliant, and highly impressionable Oxford scholar named Edmund Campion, who was then agonizing over his faith in the quiet isolation of Ireland. Reading the smuggled accounts of how an old, educated man suffered so steadfastly for his religious convictions profoundly and irreversibly changed the trajectory of Campion's life. He could not erase the haunting mental image of Story's unyielding defiance. Campion would later abandon his promising English career, flee to the continent, become an ordained Jesuit priest, and return secretly to the shadows of England to minister to hidden Catholics. While the English Protestant state rightfully viewed Dr. John Story as a deeply dangerous, fanatical traitor who got exactly the bloody end he deserved, the Roman Catholic Church viewed him through an entirely different lens. To Rome, he was a righteous man who died defending the eternal true faith against a heretical, illegitimate government. Centuries later, in December 1886, Pope Leo XIII officially recognized his sacrifice and beatified him, eternally granting him the exalted title of Blessed John Story. The gruesome spectacle of Dr. John Story's execution was intended by the Elizabethan state to be a definitive, terrifying period at the end of the Catholic threat. However, in the complex mathematics of religious warfare, a public execution rarely extinguishes a fire. it simply scatters the embers. The brutal dismemberment of the old inquisitor did not solidify the Queen's absolute authority. Instead, it acted as a violent psychological catalyst for the very individuals the state was desperately trying to control. As Story's broken body was dragged away from the mud of Tyburn, the true ideological war for the soul of England was just beginning. Let us shift our gaze from the brutalized remains of a state enemy to the gleaming trajectory of an intellectual star. Consider the paradox of Edmund Campion. Condemned by the state as a venomous agent of foreign powers, he would eventually be hunted across the continent and mercilessly stretched upon the rack. Yet just a decade prior, he was the absolute jewel of Oxford University, the charismatic darling of Queen Elizabeth's royal court, promised the absolute pinnacle of wealth, bishoprics, and influence by the most powerful men in the realm. How does a man forsake the golden, glittering embrace of an empire to willingly embrace the blood-soaked wood of the martyr's block? To understand the radicalization of Edmund Campion, we must examine the brilliant, fragile world he inhabited before it was shattered. Born in London in 1540, Campion was the son of a bookseller. Unlike Story's rigid, unyielding upbringing, Campion was a child of the Renaissance, a boy possessing an intellect so dazzling, a memory so flawless, and a charm so magnetic that he transcended his common birth. He was selected to be a scholar at Christ's Hospital, and by the age of 13 was chosen to deliver a formal public oration to Queen Mary I as she passed through London. His genius paved his way to St. John's College, Oxford, where he didn't just succeed, he utterly dominated the academic landscape. By the late 1560s, Edmund Campion was widely considered the most brilliant young man in England. He was a master of rhetoric, a captivating debater, and a scholar beloved by virtually everyone who met him. When Queen Elizabeth I made a grand, highly publicized royal visit to Oxford in 1566, the university chose Campion to welcome her. He delivered an elegant, stunning Latin oration that completely captivated the Queen. Elizabeth was mesmerized by his intellect. The Queen's closest favorite, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, immediately became his patron. Even William Cecil, the cold, calculating architect of the English intelligence network, referred to Campion as the Diamond of England. The path before him was paved with gold. He was expected to become a powerful bishop, a leading voice in the newly established Church of England, and a pillar of the Elizabethan state. But Campion was harboring a dangerous, agonizing secret. While he outwardly conformed to the Protestant state, taking the oath of supremacy and even being ordained as an Anglican deacon in 1569, his internal spiritual life was in a state of violent, agonizing turmoil. He was a man deeply drawn to the ancient traditions of the Catholic Church, yet utterly terrified of losing the glittering life he had built. He was the quintessential Tudor survivor, attempting to walk a tightrope of compromise in an era that increasingly demanded absolute, fanatical certainty. He tried to convince himself that he could serve the Protestant Queen while keeping his Catholic conscience hidden in the quiet corners of his mind. That fragile psychological tightrope violently snapped in the summer of 1571. Campion was not standing in the roaring crowd at Tyburn. He had already fled to Ireland seeking a quiet refuge from the tightening grip of the state. Yet the physical distance offered no protection from the psychological shockwave of Dr. John Story's execution. As detailed letters and hushed testimonies detailing the horrific, humiliating death of the old scholar reached Campion across the Irish Sea, Something inside the brilliant young man irrevocably broke. The visceral reality of state-sponsored terror, coupled with the bitter aftermath of the failed Northern Rebellion, shattered his illusions of compromise. He realized with terrifying clarity that the Elizabethan religious settlement was a regime built on iron blood and the suppression of conscience. The Diamond of England could no longer live a lie. Shortly after news of Story's execution spread, Campion abandoned any hope of returning to his fellowship at Oxford, turned his back on the Earl of Leicester's patronage, and fully embraced the life of a hunted fugitive. Hunted by the authorities in Ireland, he slipped away in disguise, crossing the sea to the English college at Douai, a seminary in Flanders, dedicated to training Catholic priests to return to England. But Douai was not enough to satisfy the burning conviction that had been ignited. Campion felt a profound, overriding need to completely strip himself of his ego, his worldly ambitions, and his past compromises. In 1573, he made a grueling, perilous pilgrimage, walking barefoot across the jagged peaks of the Alps all the way to Rome. There, he knocked on the door of the Society of Jesus. He sought to become a Jesuit, the most disciplined, intellectually elite, and feared order of Catholic priests in the world. They were the spiritual shock troops of the Counter-Reformation, and to the English government, they were public enemy number one. For years, Campion disappeared into the rigorous, silent, and deeply spiritual training of the Jesuit order in Bohemia. He taught, he prayed, and he prepared his soul. He believed his life in England was over, a closed chapter of a brilliant but compromised youth. However, the political winds were shifting yet again. By 1580, the Catholic Church, desperate to stop the complete eradication of their faith in England, made a bold, highly dangerous decision. They would launch a secret underground spiritual invasion. They organized a clandestine mission to infiltrate the borders of Elizabethan England, intending to minister to the hidden, terrified Catholic populace and bring them the forbidden sacraments. To lead this highly dangerous mission, they needed their most brilliant, charismatic minds. They called upon their two greatest English exiles, the fiercely political Robert Persons and the universally beloved gentle scholar Edmund Campion. When Campion received his orders from Rome to return to the nation that would undoubtedly kill him if he were caught, he did not hesitate. He had spent 9 years preparing for this exact moment. The man who had once been courted by Queen Elizabeth I was now returning as an outlaw, destined to live in the shadows, hiding in secret priest holes, and celebrating the Mass by candlelight. The intellectual star was about to declare a spiritual war on the most powerful state intelligence apparatus in the world. The transformation from the celebrated Diamond of England to a hardened, fiercely disciplined soldier of the Counter-Reformation was complete. But the most dangerous phase of Campion's life still lay ahead. Rome and Bohemia had provided the spiritual armor, but now he had to physically transport that armor back into the heart of the enemy's fortress. The English Channel was no longer just a body of water. It was the heavily fortified border of an aggressive surveillance state, waiting to butcher any man who dared to bring the old faith back to its shores. To cross it required not just absolute faith, but a master class in deception. We must comprehend the sheer audacity of Campion's mission and the terrifying reality of the border he was crossing. By the summer of 1580, Queen Elizabeth I and her spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, had transformed England into a fortress of paranoia. The ports were heavily guarded, flooded with informants, and meticulously watched for any sign of Catholic infiltrators. Returning to English soil as a Catholic priest was no longer just an act of defiance. Under the newly tightened laws, it was an act of high treason. Knowing this, Edmund Campion and his fiery superior Robert Persons slipped across the English Channel in deep disguise. Campion stepped onto the docks of Dover masquerading as a flashy, slightly arrogant Irish jewel merchant named Mr. Edmonds. He wore a velvet hat, a sword at his hip, and carried himself with the swagger of a man who belonged in the bustling, materialistic world of Tudor commerce. The disguise was thin, but Campion's legendary charm, the very same charm that had once captivated the Queen, was his greatest weapon. He casually bantered with the port authorities, deflected their suspicions, and successfully melted into the crowded, treacherous streets of London. The underground spiritual invasion had officially begun. What followed was a life of unrelenting, suffocating terror and profound spiritual devotion. Campion and his fellow priests operated within a deeply clandestine network of Catholic safe houses, relying on the bravery of aristocratic families who secretly refused to abandon the old faith. These houses were modified by brilliant underground architects, most notably a man named Nicholas Owen, who spent his life constructing incredibly elaborate, concealed hiding spaces known as priest holes. Whenever the Queen's heavily armed priest hunters, the pursuivants, smashed through the front doors of a manor house in the dead of night, Campion would be rushed into these dark, stifling cavities behind fireplaces, under floorboards, or within solid brick walls. He would huddle in the pitch black, listening to the heavy boots of the state agents tearing the house apart just inches from his face, knowing that a single cough meant an agonizing death. When the hunters left, the true work began. Campion traveled relentlessly across the English countryside, moving from Berkshire to Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire to Lancashire. He rode primarily at night, a phantom in the Tudor mist. He would arrive at a safe house, hear confessions from terrified Catholics who had not seen a priest in years, preach fervent sermons in hushed tones, and celebrate the forbidden Mass at dawn before vanishing again. His presence was an electric shock to the deeply suppressed Catholic community. The Diamond of England had returned to them, and his eloquence and gentle bravery galvanized a population that the state had tried to crush into submission. However, Campion was painfully aware of the political reality. He knew the Elizabethan government would inevitably frame his purely religious mission as a violent political conspiracy to assassinate the Queen. To protect his legacy and the integrity of his faith, he sat down in a secret room and drafted a brilliant, forceful manifesto addressed to the Queen's Privy Council. He meant for this document to be kept strictly hidden, to be released only as an explanation of his motives if he were captured and silenced. History, however, has a way of hijacking even the best-laid plans. Thomas Pound, a zealous Catholic layman to whom Campion had entrusted a copy, was so overwhelmed by the sheer power of the writing that he secretly had the document copied and widely distributed. Within weeks, the manuscript, which the public aggressively dubbed Campion's Brag, was being read in the streets of London, debated in taverns, and slipped under the doors of Protestant bishops. Campion's Brag was a masterpiece of Elizabethan rhetoric. It completely shattered the government's narrative. Campion eloquently and respectfully declared that his mission was strictly spiritual, not political. He explicitly stated he had no interest in statecraft, treason, or foreign invasions. His only goal was to preach the gospel, minister to the souls of his countrymen, and freely debate the Protestant theologians of the realm on the merits of their faith. He ended the document with a staggering declaration of absolute resolve, famously writing that the Jesuit order had made a league to cheerfully carry the cross England laid upon them, and that the expenses reckoned, the enterprise is begun, it is of God, it cannot be withstood. The public release of the brag was a catastrophic embarrassment for the Elizabethan state. Campion had essentially thrown down an intellectual and spiritual gauntlet, and the entire nation was watching. Queen Elizabeth was furious. William Cecil was apoplectic. This hunted fugitive had bypassed their massive censorship apparatus and captured the public imagination. The Elizabethan government realized that Campion was far more dangerous alive and writing than he ever could be commanding a foreign army. In response, Walsingham unleashed the full terrifying might of the English intelligence service. The manhunt for Edmund Campion was immediately escalated from a routine policing matter to a massive nationwide emergency. Bounties were drastically raised. Spies were planted in taverns, prisons, and foreign embassies. Suspected Catholics were dragged from their beds and violently interrogated. The net was rapidly, methodically closing in, and the golden scholar who had dared to outwit an empire was rapidly running out of shadows to hide in. The delicate game of cat and mouse across the English countryside was rapidly escalating into a brutal, highly coordinated military sweep. As the summer of 1581 wore on, the bounty on Campion's head grew, the loyalty of the underground network was violently tested, and the terrifying reality of a state-sponsored betrayal became not a matter of if, but exactly when. By July of 1581, the nationwide manhunt had reached a fever pitch. Sir Francis Walsingham's intelligence network had flooded the countryside with informants. They relied heavily on professional priest hunters, known as pursuivants, and ruthless opportunists eager to collect the state's blood money. One such man was George Eliot, an apostate Catholic with a criminal past, who possessed a deep, intimate knowledge of the underground Catholic network. He became the Judas of the Elizabethan era. Campion, exhausted from months of relentless travel and constant suffocating fear, had arrived at Lyford Grange in Berkshire, the sprawling manor of the deeply Catholic Yate family. He had intended to stay only briefly, but the tearful pleading of the local Catholic community convinced the gentle scholar to linger just a few days longer. It was a fatal, tragic concession to empathy. On Sunday, July 16th, Campion was celebrating Mass for dozens of secret worshippers when George Eliot, posing as a devout Catholic seeking spiritual comfort, infiltrated the congregation. Eliot recognized Campion immediately. Feigning piety, he quietly slipped away from the estate, mounted his horse, and rode fiercely to alert the local magistrates. Within hours, Lyford Grange was entirely surrounded by heavily armed state militia. Panic erupted among the faithful. Campion, along with 2 other priests, was rapidly shoved into a specially designed architectural hideaway, a narrow, airless priest hole, concealed entirely behind a false wall above the stairs. The magistrates smashed through the doors, tearing the ancient house apart piece by piece. They relentlessly sounded the floorboards and interrogated the terrified family. For hours, the search yielded nothing. But George Eliot would not let his bounty escape. He insisted they tear into the very walls themselves. As a guard aggressively hammered his crowbar against a seemingly solid timber partition above the stairs, he noticed a hollow thud and a faint sliver of light breaking through a crack. The false wall was violently smashed open. Inside the dark, stifling cavity lay the 3 priests, side by side, their hands folded in silent prayer. The greatest manhunt in Elizabethan England had finally ended. Campion was dragged from the hole, heavily shackled in cold iron, and paraded all the way back to London as a spectacular trophy of the state. To maximize the public humiliation, his captors tied his legs securely beneath his horse's belly and forced a mocking paper sign upon his head that read, "Campion, the seditious Jesuit." He was marched through the jeering crowds of the capital and thrown directly into the Little Ease, an infamous, cramped dungeon within the Tower of London, where a man could neither fully stand nor lie down. Yet the Crown recognized that executing a man of Campion's staggering intellectual fame without breaking him first would create a powerful martyr. 3 days after his imprisonment, Campion was quietly taken from his dungeon under heavy guard and brought by boat to a private mansion. There, to his utter shock, he found himself standing face to face with the 3 most powerful figures in the realm: the Earl of Leicester, his former patron, Lord Burghley, the architect of state security, and Queen Elizabeth I herself. It was a staggering reunion. The Queen, remembering the golden youth who had mesmerized her at Oxford years ago, offered him a complete unconditional pardon. Leicester offered him high office, wealth, and the prestigious Archbishopric of Canterbury. They asked only one thing in return: that he publicly renounce his Catholic faith and conform to the Protestant state. For the exhausted prisoner, it was the ultimate intoxicating temptation. Campion politely, gently, and absolutely refused. He stated that he recognized Elizabeth as his lawful queen in all temporal matters, but he could not surrender his conscience to the state. With the golden carrot firmly rejected, the Elizabethan state immediately brought out the iron stick. Campion was returned to the Tower, and the order was given to unleash the full, terrifying mechanics of state torture. He was taken to the subterranean torture chambers and strapped to the rack. This horrific machine was designed to slowly, agonizingly pull a human body apart, dislocating the shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees. The interrogators demanded the names of the Catholic families who had sheltered him. Campion endured the tearing of his joints and the sheer blinding agony of the rack repeatedly over several months. Yet through the absolute crushing torment, he refused to betray his flock. Frustrated by their inability to extract a political confession, the government decided to destroy him intellectually. They organized a series of highly public theological debates in the chapel of the Tower of London, pitting the shattered prisoner against the finest, most rested Protestant theologians of the realm. The state intended to humiliate him, to prove his Catholic theology was as bankrupt as his alleged treason. It was a profound miscalculation. Campion was carried into the chapel, his body so brutally ruined by the rack that he could not raise his own hands to hold a Bible. Yet, the moment the debate began, the scholar flared back to life. Deprived of books and notes, Campion relied entirely on his flawless memory. He effortlessly cited scripture and ancient church fathers, running intellectual rings around his well-fed opponents. His eloquence was so devastating that the public observers began to openly sympathize with the broken man. The state abruptly canceled the remaining debates. They knew they could not defeat him with words. By November of 1581, the government realized the complete failure of their psychological warfare. Campion had survived the rack without betraying his network and humiliated the state's finest theologians. Fearful of his growing legendary status, the Crown decided they could no longer afford to keep him alive. However, they needed to avoid confirming his status as a religious martyr. Therefore, Walsingham meticulously engineered a fabricated political conspiracy. On November 20th, 1581, Campion and several other captured Catholic priests were brought into the cavernous expanse of Westminster Hall. The government charged them with a massive treasonous conspiracy, alleging they had plotted to raise a foreign army and assassinate Queen Elizabeth I. It was a spectacular, entirely manufactured legal farce. When the time came for the prisoners to formally enter their pleas, a moment of profound historical resonance occurred. The clerk of the court ordered Campion to raise his right hand. Campion, however, had been stretched so brutally on the rack that the muscles in his arms were completely destroyed. He stood in the damp hall, physically incapable of lifting his own hand to defend his life. In a gesture that moved even the Protestant spectators, one of his fellow condemned priests gently leaned over, kissed Campion's ruined hand, and physically raised it to the sky for him so that the scholar could formally declare not guilty. What followed was a trial in name only. Campion mounted a flawless legal defense, methodically dismantling the state's forged evidence and exposing the perjured testimonies of paid informants. He eloquently argued that the state was attempting to criminalize conscience, stating, "If our religion do make us traitors, we are worthy to be condemned, but otherwise are, and have been, as good subjects as ever the Queen had." The jury, bound by the expectations of the crown, deliberated for barely an hour before returning a verdict of guilty. When the Lord Chief Justice officially pronounced the terrifying sentence of hanging, drawing, and quartering, the courtroom descended into silence. Campion did not weep, nor did he rage against his captors. Instead, he stared down the royal judges and delivered a chillingly prophetic speech, declaring that to be condemned for teaching the ancient faith of their ancestors was both glory and joy to us. The execution took place on the bitterly cold morning of December 1st, 1581. Just like Dr. John's story a decade before him, Edmund Campion was strapped to a flat wooden hurdle and dragged through the deep mud and jagged stones of London to the execution grounds at Tyburn. However, the spiritual theater of their final moments could not have been more completely opposed. Where John's story had died, fighting, kicking, and screaming in terrified agony, Edmund Campion approached the butcher's block with a profound, almost supernatural serenity. The massive crowd that had gathered at Tyburn, expecting to see a ruined, broken traitor, was instead met with a man of absolute peace. Standing on the scaffold, he calmly refused demands to confess his political treason. Instead, he loudly forgave the spies who had hunted him and prayed aloud for Queen Elizabeth. The cart was pulled away. The state, perhaps fearing a massive public riot if they subjected the widely beloved scholar to the full immediate horrors of evisceration, allowed Campion to hang until he was fully dead. The subsequent brutal mutilations of drawing and quartering were carried out on a lifeless corpse, sparing him the agonizing final moments endured by Dr. Story. His remains were then displayed on the city gates as rotting trophies. Yet Walsingham's plan to destroy the Jesuit threat had catastrophically backfired. The state had not killed a political traitor. They had publicly minted a saint. According to enduring Catholic tradition, as Campion's quarters were being hacked apart by the executioner, a single stray drop of the martyr's warm blood splashed directly onto the coat of a young, aristocratic Protestant bystander named Henry Walpole. Whether a literal physical occurrence or a powerful historical metaphor, the spectacle at Tyburn acted as a psychological earthquake. Walpole was instantly and profoundly radicalized. He was a wealthy, fashionable young lawyer standing comfortably among the London elite, insulated by Protestant wealth and legal prestige. Yet, the illusion of the Elizabethan state's moral authority evaporated before his eyes. He realized that a government requiring such horrific theatrical butchery to sustain its theology was inherently bankrupt. Unable to shake the terrifying, awe-inspiring memory of Campion's final words, Walpole abandoned his legal studies entirely. He secretly composed and distributed a passionate poem eulogizing Campion, an act of literary defiance that immediately put Walsingham spies on his trail. Knowing his life in England was over, Walpole fled across the sea to Reims, France, and eventually journeyed to Rome. Following the exact perilous footsteps of the man whose execution he had witnessed, he joined the Society of Jesus. He was no longer a lawyer of the realm. He was a soldier of the Counter-Reformation. Back in England, Sir Francis Walsingham and Lord Burghley realized with growing horror that public executions were actively advertising the Catholic underground. In response, the Elizabethan government abandoned any remaining pretense of religious tolerance and transformed England into a pioneering, highly sophisticated surveillance state. In 1585, they passed the draconian act against Jesuits, seminary priests, and such other like disobedient persons. This staggering piece of legislation made the mere physical presence of a Catholic priest on English soil an act of high treason. Furthermore, anyone caught sheltering or feeding a priest would be convicted of a felony and hanged. The state had legally weaponized the basic act of human charity. To enforce these suffocating new laws, Walsingham deployed a new breed of state terror, spearheaded by men like Richard Topcliffe. Topcliffe was Queen Elizabeth's premier priest hunter and chief interrogator. He was granted unprecedented authority to torture suspects privately in his own home. He boasted that his personal torture devices, which included heavy iron manacles designed to hang men by their wrists until their chest cavities collapsed, were far more agonizing than the state's traditional rack. This was the terrifying, ironclad fortress that Henry Walpole chose to infiltrate in December 1593. After over a decade in exile, Walpole was ordered to return to England. His mission was doomed almost before it began. Walsingham's intelligence network was now flawlessly efficient. Within 24 hours of stepping onto English soil, Walpole was betrayed by a local informant, arrested at a rural inn, and thrown into the dungeons of York Castle. When Richard Topcliffe received word of the capture, Walpole was transferred to the Tower of London and placed entirely under Topcliffe's sadistic control. The brilliant former lawyer was thrown into the Salt Tower, a freezing cell where he was subjected to absolute sensory deprivation. Over the next year, Topcliffe brutally tortured Walpole 14 separate times, stretching his body until his arms were completely paralyzed. Topcliffe desperately wanted Walpole to confess to fabricated political conspiracies. But just like Campion before him, Walpole retreated into an unbreakable inner spiritual fortress. Deprived of paper and the use of his mangled hands, the broken scholar used a small piece of smuggled chalk to carve the names of saints, angels, and Catholic martyrs directly into the stone walls of his cell, inscriptions that can still be seen today. He physically deteriorated until he was little more than a skeleton, but his intellect and his conscience remained entirely unconquered. In April 1595, recognizing that the prisoner would yield nothing, the state transferred Walpole back to York for his inevitable rigged treason trial. When he stood before the judges, his body was so ruined by Topcliffe's manacles that he had to be physically held upright by the guards. He eloquently defended his innocence, but the guilty verdict was delivered in minutes. On April 7th, 1595, Henry Walpole was dragged on a hurdle to the execution grounds at Knavesmire in York. As he stood on the scaffold, facing the same horrific butchering death he had witnessed 14 years prior, he did not flinch. He prayed for the Queen, he prayed for his executioners, and he embraced his fate with the same transcendent, terrifying peace as the man who had inspired him. The agonizing death of Henry Walpole marked the culmination of a multi-generational tragedy. The religious whiplash of the 16th century had left a trail of broken bodies, but it also fundamentally reshaped the architecture of statecraft. We look back with horror at the state-sanctioned violence of the Tudor era. Yet we must recognize that the Elizabethan state, spearheaded by William Cecil and Sir Francis Walsingham, did not merely win a religious skirmish. They authored the grim blueprint for the modern national security state. Walsingham institutionalized systematic espionage, utilizing encrypted communications and mass surveillance. By passing laws that criminalize conscience, the state legally erased the boundary between a private thought and a public crime. However, the intertwined tragedies of Story, Campion, and Walpole expose the fundamental vulnerability of terror as a tool of governance. State violence did not amputate an ideology. It acted as an accelerant. The physical legacy of this shadow war remains vividly etched into the landscape of modern England. Scattered across the countryside, hidden deep within the oak-paneled walls of Tudor manor houses, lie the surviving priest holes. These stifling claustrophobic architectural cavities, many engineered by the brilliant martyred builder Nicholas Owen, stand today as silent, chilling monuments to the terrifying reality of the Elizabethan surveillance state and the desperate lengths human beings will go to protect their inner beliefs. We no longer utilize the butcher's block to enforce ideological conformity. The grim gallows have been relegated to history. Yet the fundamental conflict between absolute state security and individual freedom of thought endures. The ghosts of Tyburn whisper a timeless, chilling warning. When a society attempts to control the souls of its people by breaking their bodies, it inevitably writes its own historical damnation.